Amazing. So that was Rasidul's way to tell us that it's time we begin this webinar. So hello everyone, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And today we have a very action-packed agenda planned for you. In previous week we covered certain basics of supply chain sustainability. Right. This week we plan on going really deep with the subject, and that's why it's a pleasure to invite Abhirup Das to host this entire session for us. A brief about Abhirup: he's my co-founder, right? He's my go-to person for anything sustainability, right? And he's one person who, again, you can think of a corner of sustainability, and he'll have an understanding of this. And from a background perspective, he's a petroleum engineer, hardcore energy expert. And he also spent some time doing operations at GSPC. After that, he was in IIM Ahmedabad and then IBM for a bit, and has been building Oren and the the inner technical engine of Oren per se. I would also like to give you a very brief background about who we are, what we do. So we are an enterprise grade ESG platform and consulting firm. We work with leading public and private companies across sectors and across the world. You can see some of the companies that we're working with on your screen. And for this great work, we've also won multiple awards through our journey, right? So a little bit of housekeeping here. I was going to say housewarming. Yeah, a little bit of housekeeping here. Rasidul, Pulkit, and I would be manning the chat. So in case you have any question, please leave it in the chat. We would want Abhirup to kind of go through his flow, right? In the middle, if at all we think that Abhirup has already covered something and it would be of value for everyone else to also have your question answered in the middle, we'll unmute ourselves, make Abhirup pause and take that question as well. But beyond that, we have reserved some time towards the end to cover all your questions, right? And again, we're here on the chat. In case there's something that we can tackle, we'll definitely respond to that. So without much further ado, I'll pass on the stage to Abhirup, and we can begin the session.
Thank you, Arushi, for the introduction. So, hello everyone, good afternoon. So today we are running the second leg of the supply chain sustainability program webinar, right? So what we have decided earlier, and we have also spoken to you about what we are going to cover today. So today's agenda will be just about how to implement these program if you are new or if you are doing it for the first time in your organization, and what are the things that can help you run this program in a much more efficient and much more better way, so that you get a good enough outcome or to a best outcome that you can think of, right? So that is the entire agenda of today's session. So now I'll start with mainly the supplier selection and prioritization criteria that we discussed in the last call or last webinar also. So I'll maybe spend a couple of minutes on that just to recap onto it. Second thing that I wanted to focus on this webinar is mainly the success factors. Today, based on all the implementation, all the programs that we have done with our clients, what we have seen certain success factors, and again, like I'll be only talking about the main factors here. Those factors typically play a very important role to make your program success or a not so much of a successful plan, right? So those things I have tried to add in this webinar. Second thing is that recommended process. So I'm sure like the process would not be new to you. Every process looks like the same, but what we have done and what we have kind of reprofiled, or maybe like based on all the experiences that we have done, we have tried to kind of make it much more palatable to the Indian context. So that is what I would like to speak about. And finally, supply chain management KPIs that we should be tracking, because like I've seen also multiple companies do kind of write up and do kind of do these activities, but then there is no KPIs being tracked, or maybe I would say, if not no, there are very few KPIs that companies are tracking, that what is the total coverage percentage of suppliers and vendors who are covered in this program, right? If that is the only metric, or maybe like a additional few metric that you are tracking, in that case, it becomes a very broader definition to it. So that's where what are the recommended KPIs that you can track to kind of also analyze where are we lacking in terms of your engagement with the value chain partners. That is what I'm going to talk about. And finally, the best practices based on purely our experiences of running this or doing this with clients. So that is what I'm going to cover, right? So now moving on to the first part, which is the supplier prioritization criteria. So like today, if you see, the most common and the most used approach for any kind of supply selection is the spend-based method, where you typically apply the 80-20 rule, where the first 20% of your vendors, right, or the top 20% of your vendors, as per your spend, becomes like kind of a critical vendors, and you run your programs at least for that first time with those particular vendors only, right? So this is the most simple and most common one. But what we have understood and what we have seen, when you are defining a critical vendor in your supply chain sustainability program, it is not only limited to the spend, because there are also additional parameters in play. And when we look into ESG as a risk management framework or risk management criteria, in that case, multiple factors needs to be included for analyzing and selecting those particular vendors which are of importance to the company. So that's where these things are much more important. So apart from vendor spend, second thing is that substitutability of the vendor, right? If you have, let's say, only a single vendor or maybe like two vendors who can provide you a certain raw material or certain packaging material or certain material, right? In that case, the dependency on those vendors are also high for you. So, and that is the case, you have to definitely include those vendors into the program, even if, let's say, they are not in your 80-20, in your top 20 vendor list. So that is an additional list that can be added. Similarly, what we have seen, the type of materials, like I mentioned, as per the top 20% spend, it might vary based on the year that we are analyzing. If, let's say, there is a major expansion happening in your company and where you have a large chunk of capital expenditure being done, and when we are analyzing the entire total vendor spend, in that case, it might be possible that those vendors who are providing you the capex equipments or infra supplies, those qualify on those top 20% as per that criteria, right? So in that case, you should also look into the other factors, which are your raw materials or maybe like packaging materials. Similarly, for a services industry, it would be critical services that you consume, like your cloud services, or maybe like kind of any kind of digital services that you have, or even marketing agencies, which can be applicable to a D2C kind of engagement company. Again, like, it varies from different companies to companies, but this is one thing that we should be looking at, that because your operations are dependent on such critical vendors, which might not be at the top of your spend, but if you are dependent on them, in that case, those vendors should also be included. Fifth, one more criteria that we have seen is also the supplier quantity or supply quantity that we are consuming. So again, like what we discussed about the substitutability of the vendor, if you have, let's say, n number of vendors also, but then you consume most amount of that same raw material or same material from a particular vendor, but still not qualifying in any of the earlier criteria that you have seen, for in that category, in that criteria also, you should include those vendors where you are consuming the largest quantity of certain materials, certain spares, certain parts, or certain kind of packaging materials that we are talking about, right? And finally, one more criteria which has been, again, like been prominent in the last couple of years post COVID era, is the geographical presence. So today, as in the last session also we discussed, that geographical presence of the vendor also becomes much more critical from a geopolitical viewpoint and from an ESG lens also. Because if there is a company based out of, let's say, Ukraine or Iran, who is already a sanctioned country, in that case, it will be very difficult for you to operate or like transact with them. And like, I am taking these examples because there's something common available to us, but then we are not sure exactly what will happen with other countries which might be in that scenario, right? So that's where we should look into certain strategic areas, certain strategic countries, where if you have any kind of risk profile, any kind of higher risk for any vendor belonging to that country, those vendors should also be included. And again, like this is an optional one, but then if you kind of prioritize or do your vendor selection process through this multifactorial analysis, it will give you a much better input or much better output, because you are rightly selecting your critical vendors at the starting point itself, right? Now, moving on to the next part, which is the critical success factors. So why I noted down these things just after the prioritization is because, see, like when we start this engagement and a program, either it can be because of a mandate by a regulator, or maybe something that we are doing as because we have taken some initiatives and goals as in the company, right? So I've seen multiple reasons why companies do into get into the supply chain engagement, and again, like it can be also scope 3 reduction and all of these things. So it can vary from anything just a compliance requirement to kind of any aspiration requirement or aspiration of a company where we want to kind of decarbonize, right? In any of these case scenario, for a successful implementation of this program, the most important part is an executive or leadership sponsorship. What we have seen today is that if you don't involve your leadership team, and if they are not aware that what is happening in the supply chain program, right, it will be always a bottoms up approach, where you are reaching out to someone at your vendors team who will be from the sales team. They will also try to kind of tag along their compliance team, sustainability team, to get you their data. They'll give back your data, then again they will not understand what are your requirements and all of these initial inertia by a vendor, or maybe like something I would say more of a negligence, because that is not their job priority or job role. In that case, it can be eliminated, even if, let's say, an email lands up to the leadership team of that vendor from your MD or anyone from the leadership team. This essentially cuts down the entire friction that is happening on the vendor side, right? Second thing that we have also seen is more of a long-term strategic commitment that we need to show to the vendors. Because if you want to just run this program and say that we want this data and we are doing this program from so and so year, and this is the data points that we need, right? Until unless you show this entire long-term commitment for a vendor, that if you reply to this assessment that you have shared with you, and if you also take some actions or like improvement areas that we highlight, what are the outcomes that you can expect from a long-term viewpoint, right? Until unless that thing is clear, like if we are talking about a scope 3 decarbonization, that should be a roadmap that you tell. Or maybe it can be something aligned as a preferred vendor, or let's say a green certified vendor, anything, right? If you tell them what is the strategic commitment that you are looking at and what is the expectation from a vendor, that would give you a better output, rather than just keeping them on like completely blank, saying that yeah, this is just an assessment and it is an additional requirement that we are going to put to you. So they would take it more on a negative front. Similarly, operational and process point of view, until and unless you have a buy-in from the procurement and the like sales sorry procurement team, and buy-in means it is not only just training them about what we are doing and what are the help that you need from them, but also some kind of an alignment that yeah, like because supply chain sustainability is a risk criteria or risk mitigation criteria for the company. We need to kind of improve these criterias or KPIs over the years, and that is why it is also part of your job process or your KPIs. So until unless that happens, there is also like kind of a larger gap, which we have seen that the procurement team involvement might be very much scarce in the initial part and then kind of later on. But then until unless you make them understand why we are doing it and what exactly is the outcome, a positive outcome or maybe like a very good outcome from the program might be questionable. One more thing that we have seen, phased rolled out strategy. See, here what we have observed, if we want to cover up a very large number of vendors, and when I say large, it can be anything beyond 100, I would say. If you are trying to engage more than 100 vendors, until unless you have a tiered approach, I would say this number should be around 30 to 40 vendors in a typical go. From there, if you want to improve or if you want to grow the numbers, the best possible way to kind of have a tiered approach where you run the assessment cycle differently for different tiers, and that will also give you room for like running the program in a different manner, and at the same time you can address different type of vendors at different cycle of your year. So this is one thing that we have seen works well. Now, from a data and technology viewpoint, see, today it seems very much impossible to do a supply chain sustainability engagement program without a sustainable technology platform, right? Even if it can be embedded into your vendor management or spend management platform, that is also okay. But then doing it with anything beyond, let's say, 50 as a number of vendors would be very much troublesome problem for you to, first of all, collect the data, actually maintain that data, give them a tracking, recording, and also kind of also track their performance year on year. So that's where it becomes a very important player for it. We have tagged it as a medium importance in the critical success factors. Similarly, robust data management and analytics. These two things are much more important from a long-term viewpoint. Like for an initial year, it might be something that you can start with rolling out with a Excel-based approach, but I would recommend to kind of go for a technology approach only, because in that case you would have a benchmark already ready. Your vendors will be also familiar with the program and the process, and at the same time you don't have to again redo the same exercise of training them using the platform, what kind of expense expectations that you have in, let's say, follow-up years, right? So that makes your job easy as a sustainability supply chain program manager. And the final thing is that supplier and external dependencies. So these two lines are something that I would say, is more of an external dependency, that supplier willingness and capacity, right? So from a willingness and capacity viewpoint, see, willingness is something very much subjective. From a capacity viewpoint, what we can think of is that are the financials of the vendor really good, or at least good to kind of take any action or initiative on this? That can be one criteria we check, that do they have the capability or not. Second thing is willingness. That is where the first long-term strategic commitment comes into picture. The vendor will be only willing to take any initiative if you show some commitment and show some kind of a long-term engagement with them. If they feel that, yeah, like I am just treated as another vendor to you, and if I don't do it, you have an ample number of other vendors who can engage with you. In that case, the willingness difficulty is very much difficult to kind of identify. Similarly, regulator and customer demands. Today, as I mentioned, typically companies start doing this because of a regulatory mandate or a customer demand. So that also works on the favor of doing this. And like in India, more or less, global companies as well as MNCs are already pushing their vendors and suppliers to kind of start engaging these your supply chain and vendors for the supply chain and sustainability programs. So these are the two externalities, I would say, which also has a high probability of making your program a success. Now, moving on, what are the process, or what is the process that we need to follow, right? As I mentioned, the process might look familiar to you, because this is typically every process framework should look like. So first one is foundation and alignment, where we are trying to kind of establish that what will be the length of the program, what kind of vendors that we are taking care of, the prioritization metrics, then kind of KPIs, goals, who will take that responsibility, will we do it internally or externally, do we need to engage us consultant for this, do we need to kind of also have a technology platform for it, what kind of mechanism that we are going to follow, is there any kind of incentive mechanism for vendors? So there are so many things that are needed to be on the foundation and alignment phase itself, which can take another like a couple of weeks for you, right? In the phase two is the supplier prioritization and the tool implementation part, right? So these two phases can take up like a month's time, because in the initial foundation and alignment, the time that would be needed primarily is to engage the supply chain team or the procurement team. making them aware of the program details, what kind of support that would be needed from you, from them, what kind of details that you need from them to kind of start the engagement process. Those are the phase one. Phase two is where the supplier prioritization and the technology implementation part will come into picture. And these two things can be clubbed together to squeeze down the timeline, or maybe like if your internal navigation takes a longer time, in that case, you can start parallelly working on the supplier prioritization and tool implementation process, right? Now, the third thing is the internal training and pilot communications. So for the internal training, as I mentioned, there is a top level or a management level training needed where you need the alignment from the procurement team entirely that this is the program that we are running and why it is needed. Now, after that, there has to be also a training to the point of contacts, or maybe like anyone from the supplier and procurement team who is directly in contact with those vendors. For them, you need to train that this is the tool that we are going to use, this is the type of questionnaire that we are going to implement. The moment there is a uh, training being given, if we need to support them through these documentation, they can access their data points here, like all kind of help which might be needed once we start engaging the suppliers. Everything else have to be explained to the point of contacts, or the supply chain team, because for a vendor, even if let's say you deploy a tool and you are also having a consultant who is running the program, right? In that case, for any company, they are doing this assessment because you as a company, as a vendor, sorry, you as a company or a client has asked to do this. And that's where their primary contact would be the person who is directly in interaction with them from your company. So that's where this part is very much important to make the SPOC from supply chain team or the procurement team aware of the process, at least, so that they can clarify the questions that they have and direct it to the right person as a consultant or a tool provider if there are any queries, any questions that they have. Now, in phase 4 and phase 5, which is where we are actually initiating the program, right? So tier 1 and tier 2, if I am breaking down this process into, let's say, 100 vendors, I would break it down into, let's say, 30 plus 70 or maybe 40 plus 60 vendors, right? Where I would try to engage the first 30, first 40 vendors at a much more detailed engagement level, where if I get an option, I can also make it in a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 process, where only for first 20 or first 15 vendors are being included. Those vendors would be like we can have a one-to-one training programs or training sessions for them. For the rest 20 to 40 or 20 to 50 vendors that we are talking about in tier 2, for them it can be pool sessions that we take up. And for anyone beyond 50 to 100, for them it can be a combination of pool session and the recorded sessions also that we can give them. I'm just talking about a training program, but again, from a questionnaire also you can have varied programs from that end, because if let's say you consider the top 20, top 50 vendors are the most critical for you, and you need to kind of get or gauge the entire ESG maturity for them, you can have different level of questionnaire. But I would suggest, if I have to recommend, always try to have a single questionnaire for everyone, even if it may look lengthy or it may look a difficult task for the largest segment of the vendors to qualify. You make them aware on day one that this is the expectation that you have. It might take a year or two for you to get mature and start collecting the data and giving that data to us. But then you should make them aware of it, and they should expect this thing to happen. If you change the questionnaire every year, it becomes very difficult and very tricky for even the vendor to understand that why they are changing the questionnaire from last year to this year, and this year I don't even know what is going to happen next year, and that where they don't take any action on that. So this is what I would say: initiation of tier one vendors, engagement with them, and collect the data. And like kind of once that is done in a 6 weeks program, after that you can start on initiate the tier two engagement. But at the same time, that time can be utilized by you to analyze the performance of the vendors who are in part of your tier one program, right? So this is how a typical process should look like. I'll maybe go some deeper into this. Yeah. Now in the foundation phase, as I mentioned, The project charter is a very important document where we directly write down the scope, goals, and KPIs and budget and the key stakeholders. These are the 5 things that are very much needed, because without this, the program initiation would be also something that is rushed for, right? Similarly, outlining the business case out of it. So are you doing it because you want to meet a customer requirement or a regulatory requirement, or maybe like do you want to achieve something out of it? Those kind of things, if you have laid down, that is a really good outcome that you can expect out of it. Establish a steering committee. That is where the leadership, sponsorship, and as well as the different departments will come into picture. If you are able to kind of put up a structure where someone from the leadership team and multiple departments who are going to be part of this program are clubbed together and they are taking the decision together, in that case uh, you will definitely have a much larger engagement and much larger accountability within your organization. And at the same time, the seriousness for any vendor will also be high, because it is not only one department or one person tracking it. It will be multiple people from multiple department tracking this data point, and it is much more accountable within the organization. Now, creating a RACI chart. See, this is something that I would say is a bare minimum requirement for any company. Without this, starting the program itself would be impossible, right? And finally, high level communication plan. So on this as well, I would like to add one anecdote. If you kind of circulate a pre-read or maybe circulate some kind of a program initiation communications with the vendor before you start even engaging them, like let's say talking about 1 month prior, like it is all about like launching a new movie, right? You do promotional activities and then making them aware that something is coming, and that's where you get a larger attention. If you just shoot an email on random day and expect them to come to a training program that you are scheduling 1 week down the line or 2 weeks down the line, in that case, it becomes very difficult for you to also get that engagement. Until unless you create that momentum behind it, it is hard to get the initial ball rolling. So that's where it is better to create the high level communication plan on the day one. Now on the step two, the master list, definitely will get it from the supply team or the procurement team. As I mentioned, conduct a prioritization analysis based on this multi-factorial analysis that we talked about. Again, like it can be as simple as doing based on the spend-based method, whichever works for you or your organization. Development of this questionnaire, right? So this is where I was talking about, like the most important part is to kind of have the same identical questionnaire year on year, so that you can also understand how things are like how my vendor's performance is improving, decreasing, what is happening. Because if you change the questionnaire every year, in that case you don't have a benchmark. If you keep the questionnaire ready, and a typical framework that we use and we kind of implement is that it's a 5 indicator process, where we are using first indicator as a policy for any vendor. Second would be awareness or training for the vendors. Third would be monitoring. Fourth will be targets, and fifth is action. So on these 5 parameters or these 5 indicators, you can also track that what is the maturity level that we have in vendor, and accordingly you can also create your own self-assessment questionnaire. If we talk about BRSR specifically, in that case, already a BRSR core questions that we have, those 9 question or 10 question can be good enough for you to meet the compliance requirement. But to be frank, those 9 questions are not going to give you any kind of a risk metric or any kind of a performance metric on that. It is going to be just some data points that you collect. Your carbon emissions, water, waste, those data points will come into picture, right? Next part is creating the procurement training materials, right? And again, like this is something that can be outsourced if you have an onboarded a consultant or maybe any technology provider also. In that case, those things might be ready with you, but you need to fine tune those things as per the company's program also. So that is one area where you need to focus on. Secondly, conducting procurement training sessions, which will be, as I mentioned, mandatory training for the entire team. Also an interactive session for Q&A, where you will cover up all the program details, what are the objectives, and then these collaterals can be shared with the teams and spokes, right? In the communication templates also, I would recommend if the team owner, the sustainability team owner, or maybe even the consultant, if they can draft an email and the entire follow-up programs and every communication templates with the right communication wordings and keywords, that would be much better. But then I would recommend to send those emails through the client ID or maybe like the company's ID itself, even if let's say consultants have given this the draft. So it should be ideally company person who is sending these emails. And finally, communicate about the pilot to a smaller group also. And this is what your tier one supplier will come into picture. Why I've told this as a pilot as well, because in some cases, what we have seen, companies try to start this engagement with, let's say, just a top 10 vendor or top 15 vendor, where they want to do the pilot. Based on that pilot learning, the tier two vendors where they have a larger set of vendors, they kind of improve the process, they kind of make changes in the assessments questionnaire, and that becomes kind of a baseline for any company. Now in the phase 4 and phase 5, like I mentioned, it will be launching the questionnaire with tier one vendors, hosting the webinars for your learning session, proactive follow-up with the campaigns. There can be a help desk being set up for them to sort their queries on the platform, on the questionnaire, on the data points, anything that they want to talk about, right? And similar in the phase 5, what we can do is launching the questionnaire for the tier 2. Similarly, begin with tier 1 data analysis. If you have a tool, definitely the tool will give you the analysis, the benchmarking, the kind of improvement areas, gaps, risk, everything in a single place. If you are not using a tool and you are using an Excel-based approach or even any kind of internal data, in that case, you need to manually spend some time, understand what are the KPIs and the performance indicators here. And finally, like you should be able to create a feedback or maybe like an improvement plan or corrective action plan, whatever you may call it, for the suppliers, so that there is some continuity there. You should not be you should not be expecting them to fill the questionnaire again without you as a company or as a client giving them any roadmap to improve, right? Like it will look like they have sent me the questionnaire last year also. They said the same question. I'll just answer the same thing that we have answered last year. And this is something that has happened also, though. That's why I'm just keeping you aware of it. Now, on the KPIs front, so what we have tried to do in supply chain management program, what the first 2 weeks or first 4 weeks that we can spend internally before even thinking of rolling out the program or prioritization, these are the things that we should actually track, right? Where um, after the engagement, we will be able to know what is our performance area. Like spend coverage, as I mentioned, this is one thing that any company is tracking today. That out of my 100 suppliers or 100% of the suppliers as per spend, today I have already assessed 20%, 30%, 40%, 100% of my suppliers in my supply chain program. So this is something that you are already covering. Now, this critical material coverage, right? That from the multifactorial analysis, why the multifactorial analysis is important, I have already talked about it. Critical material coverage is also something that we should track as a KPI. That out of all my vendors, all my critical materials, how many critical material vendors are being covered today, and what is the percentage over there, right? Similarly, geographical risk coverage, like I mentioned, it is also being covered in your multifactorial analysis. Compliance risk coverage. Now, this is something that is not directly related to the ESG questionnaire that you might share. It can be something that you are already collecting today. I'm sure for any company, they do have some kind of a vendor onboarding form or vendor onboarding documentation where they try to analyze some kind of a quality risk or time risk or let's say financial risk of that vendor, right? So based on that, if you have anything initially done, in that case, you can use or like actually utilize that data for analyzing or finalizing those vendors who are high on those risk criteria, which might not be relevant today in this ESG questionnaire, but that because the company is also a vendor, this can also be added as a one more factor in your multi-factor analysis of your selection criteria, right? Now, this ESG risk segmentation, right? A percentage of suppliers who are categorized as high in your ESG risk. This can only be a criteria after you run this program or process for at least one cycle. Then and only then all of these data points will be available with you. And you can then tag and then kind of analyze how many vendors are falling in my high risk criteria there. And that is when it can be an improvement metric that every year we need to at least move 5%, 10% of the vendors from high risk to, let's say, medium or low risk zones, right? So that is one more KPI from a risk-based targeting viewpoint that should be tracked. Similarly, on the capacity building, so which is mainly on supplier engagement metric that we should track, what is a training percentage or training rate who attended those trainings. See, this is where the communication channel and the entire build-up that I talked about, right? The communication plan plays an important role. Expecting a cold email being sent, or let's say an email which marks every vendor in BCC and saying, "Dear vendor, we are running this program for FY 25-26 and expecting this. Please attend the call on so and so date and so time." A blanket email like this would have the least engagement for sure. And that's where this initial training, if you're inviting the vendor for a training, until unless you, let's say, like customize that mail for that person who's a contact point, or maybe at least name of that company, and which are like today with your email mass email platforms also, there are so many customization available. That kind of customization should be at least being done. And if you can have a clear cut engagement program, that would increase your training participation rate, right? Similarly, help desk interaction rate is something that you can track, which will help you analyze also the maturity as well as the accuracy of the data. And what we have also seen, that there are so many vendors who might have that data because they are publishing some sustainability reports. But when you're there answering the questionnaire, in that case, the data is not being filled, or maybe like they've sent filled it with NA and like data not available or something like that, right? This is because either the question was not clear, or maybe it is not the right person who is filling in the data. That can be a problem, and that's where any kind of help desk interaction rate can help you kind of come to that conclusion that this vendor has filled this data, but they are not interacted with the help desk and they're not also part of the training program. In that case, it might be a mismatch because the person has not understood that questionnaire. Similarly, other KPIs that you can track from a response and participation viewpoint. This is what is the response rate. This is a typical criteria that any company would be tracking. Similarly, data completeness rate, right? Now, a questionnaire, as I mentioned, if you have every year changing the length and the breadth of the questionnaire, in that case, it will be very difficult to track and benchmark. But if you maintain a single questionnaire, maybe at least for 3 to 5 year cycle, in that case, you can track this as a very good indicator or a progress indicator, saying that how the data completeness indicators for at least those high risk vendors or like not so critical vendors are improving. So that is mainly an effort that you can track through this indicator. And third thing is the time to respond. Ideally, if you give them, let's say, a 45 days window or a 60 days window to fill this data, what we have seen, most of the companies would only start filling in the data, or maybe like putting in the data only during the last 1 week or 15 days, when you would have sent multiple reminders and multiple follow-up mails. Then only then they start doing this because the deadline is nearby, right? So that's where you should also have this time to respond metric, where you are not only tracking that if a person has started filling in the data, what is the time it took for them to complete that assessment, because that is what is going to tell you the timeline for your assessment questionnaire, but also timeline for assessment completion, right? In this case, what will happen? This will also give you the much more proactive nature of your vendors. And if they have data ready, in that case, what are the problems that can be identified for the later part? So these two things can be tracked, and I would recommend to kind of track it as a KPI. Now, moving to the next part of it, which is after the assessment's been complete, right? From a continuous monitoring and progress viewpoint, this is where you need at least a historical data to make the comparison. So first thing is the energy and emission, where you are going to calculate or track that year on year, what has been the change in terms of the energy intensity or emission intensity of the company. So anyone moving upward is a negative trend or a high risk trend for you. Anyone who is moving downwards, reducing now their carbon emissions or energy consumption per intensity, in that case, that vendor is something which is progressing in this sustainability maturity area, right? Similarly, the same case goes for your water consumption, waste management practices also, and you can track an intensity number there. And a year-on-year better performance should actually imply that this vendor is actually taking some action in after all the initiative that you have rolled out. On health and safety also, you can track a LTIFR indicator, or maybe number of fatalities, number of injuries. If you are taking that data, that is it increasing or decreasing? Similarly, from a labor practices viewpoint, any kind of grievances that they are receiving from their workers primarily, or maybe employees and workers both. You can also be very much directed and pinpointed to some questions related to wages, some questions related to work benefits or human rights, anything that you feel relevant for your company. That can be tracked in your labor practices indicator. And similarly, on the governance front, it will be supplier ESG score improvement, which is a broader category and a broader KPI that you track. Also, supply chain resilience, where reduction in the number of vendors from the high risk category. So this can be a KPI that you can track as an organization, which will help you kind of visualize the entire program together and also have multiple KPIs as an improvement tracker rather than just focusing on the percentage coverage of vendors by spend, because that is a very broad and very vague number. And that's where we would recommend to kind of go deeper, take these KPIs as larger set of KPIs. From here, you can add, delete things which are relevant or not relevant for the company, right? Now, moving on to the next thing, which is typically about the best practices that we have seen. And I have broken it down into pre-program phase, during the program phase, and the post-program phase, right? I have already talking about most of the things or multiple things in my like last 30 minutes, I would say, but I would like to kind of emphasize on these things when why is it important. First thing is that top 10-20 strategic vendors should be engaged individually. This is what we have seen. If you kind of have a larger engagement and a broader personalized engagement with those top 20 top 10 vendors, they would have you would have a better response rate from them. But because if you are looking at from a long-term viewpoint, assuming that in that case, because you would expect the vendor also to take some initiatives in terms of their decarbonization, in terms of their social initiatives, in terms of employee benefits, certifications, anything that you're talking about, right? There has to be an capex or an investment by the supplier vendor, which you're expecting. In that case, if you kind of have individual sessions or individual programs running for them, that would give you a much larger and much better output in a long-term viewpoint. Secondly, involving in the right stakeholders. This is something that I tell to all the companies who start or try to start this on a rush, because compliance requirements are saying that we need to do it by we have to cover these many vendors. See, typically what happens in your procurement team or in your supplier vendor database, the typical contact point that you would have is basically the sales reps of that company, right? The moment you engage them for your, let's say, trainings and your supply chain questionnaire also, expectation, like if you expect that 100% of them will respond, or maybe even 60%, 70% of them will respond, it is very much unintuitive for them, right? Because that is not their day-to-day job. And anyway, they have to collect that data or get that data from the concerned team. So that's where if you can spend some time to build this database, where for each and every vendor you can collect the employee health and safety team person's member or compliance team or sustainability team member contact point also, and direct this questionnaire and trainings for them so that they understand the requirement, and they like this will increase your response rate drastically, that we have seen. So you have to spend time there. Third thing is that categorizing supplier by category of risk, right? See, here, the multi-factor analysis that we talked about, develop a risk maturity matrix also. If it is high emission risk or high spend risk, high risk from a geography viewpoint, that kind of risk criteria actually helps you to kind of conceptualize that why we are doing it, what are the risk factors that we are trying to tackle, what kind of which vendor is most more important from this lens. Like, because if let's say there is one vendor who is doing very phenomenal job in your sustainability and ESG practice, but then he or she, the company is falling into high risk geography, right? In that case, there is very minimal thing that you can do, but you can ensure that we are de-risking ourselves from any kind of a negative impact on the company. So those criteria or tagging on a risk front is very much important, and it will help you from a long-term viewpoint. Next is localize the template for program materials. Now, this is what we have seen not only within India, but also globally. If you can tailor your training programs to your questionnaire in the local language, that becomes very much easy for them to understand. Like today, we all operate in a global supply chain level, right? Now, to engage any supplier and vendor in China, it might be a challenge if you don't have Mandarin as a support. I'm sure like they do have people who can understand English and they can respond back. But it is just to kind of ease out this process for them. They might not be stuck, or the person who is responsible for this data, he or she might not be directly fluent. In that case, if you make it convertible to any language, in that case, that can help you get a better response. And final thing is that training internal team and supply chain relation manager, like I already mentioned, because for any vendor, the supplier relationship manager or the point of contact from the procurement team is the authority who is sending this questionnaire in a way. They expect him to know the response and direct them to the right person if they're facing any challenge. In that case, training them and equipping them with the collaterals like this is the help desk number, this is the navigation, how you should navigate to the platform. This is the document there. It is the questionnaire that you have as a pre-reads and everything. If you kind of keep everything ready for that point of contact, it becomes very easy and very impactful for your program. Now, on the program itself, when you are running this program, I have already emphasized on this, the importance of a digital platform, which can help you um, track this data of not only how many suppliers who have been part of the engagement, right? It is not only about the submission and the queries, but also you will be able to track how things are moving, all these training KPIs, all your performance KPIs, everything is in single place itself. And it will also help you like meet the deadlines, timelines, and also be ready for any audit requirement that you might have, right? Second thing is that you can also set up some kind of this virtual drop-in clinics or like kind of sessions or webinars, which can be planned maybe on a weekly basis or maybe on a fortnightly basis based on the timeline that you are thinking of, right? So that anyone who is in the journey, they can directly drop in and ask their questions if there are any. And also you can circulate those sessions as, let's say, recorded videos or webinars so that anyone can refer it from there with any kind of analysis. Third thing is that providing tiered support based on the supplier maturity, right? So as I mentioned, it can be a simple help desk that we create, but then here also, if you have a better engagement for like the top 20 vendors, top 10 vendors where you have a one-to-one interaction, in that case, that actually works well for you. So if you can provide a tiered support based on supplier maturity, that would be ideal. But if you can't do it for year one or first cycle, in that case, at least set up a help desk where they can get their questions addressed, right? Now, incentive of participation. Here, I would say like an approach should be a carrot before a stick rather than having a deterrent. If you can find out any incentive, any kind of visual indicator, kind of a scorecard where they have joint branding, like, or maybe like a preferred green vendor program or any kind of a preferred payment cycle for them, anything which is preferred or something that actually is of derived value for the vendor, that works very well. And this can help you also kind of expedite the process and get a better response from them. And final thing will be the tracking of data and escalating the gaps on a real-time basis. So if you have a consultant and if you have a digital platform, even if that is being tracked by your internal team, you will have a real-time visibility of what is happening, what is not. In that case, any questions, any doubts, you can directly solve those things on time. It will be a much better responsive approach that you take, and your suppliers and vendors also feel that, yeah, like you are also putting in efforts to get this data from them and help them improve this. So this would increase the entire engagement model with the vendors, and you can expect a better outcome out of it. Now, the final approach where you are doing a post-program analysis. Here, as I mentioned already, share individual supplier scorecard with benchmarks. There's a very basic necessity. I'm sure like any company who is doing it might be doing it. If not, then that is a red flag for this program, because you need to support your suppliers and vendors and tell them that these are the improvement areas, because these are our expectations from you, right? So if you kind of give an outline documentation, or maybe like just a table format, that these are the 5 things or 10 things that needs your action, when we are going to roll out this assessment, maybe next year or next quarter, we expect you to complete this process, or maybe complete 50% of these things, whatever you want to tell or communicate, right? Second thing is that integrate findings into procurement scorecards or contracts, right? This is one thing that I have seen happening in India. Typically, MNCs, and again, like certain sectors, I would say automotive is one of the major sector where this is happening today, where supplier performance, supplier scorecard on this supply chain sustainability engagement basically enables them to be qualified as a vendor for that company. So there is typical or maybe clear-cut guidelines saying that, yeah, if you are not meeting 60 out of 100 in my scorecard, then you will not be allowed to take part in the next RFP or next process or next project. So that is more of a deterrent, I would say. But you need to incorporate those things into your scorecard of your contract or any kind of vendor. Next thing is recognizing and celebrating high performance vendors. Now, it can be a old traditional way where if you have a annual vendor meet or annual vendor day already organized, there you kind of felicitate those vendors or performers, saying that these companies have done that. You can also ask them to present about their case studies, give them a stage to represent what they have done. Or it can be as simple as just promoting those vendors on your LinkedIn page or on any digital platform as well. It can be anything, because today the world is more of a physical experience. So in that case, you can take like digital approach, you can take a complete full-blown traditional approach to get better engagement. One more thing I would say, joint capability building initiatives. This is where I was talking about. Like, if you know that these 20 vendors and these 30 vendors are much more critical for me, and if I want to look at more from a larger viewpoint, that I want to decarbonize my value chain or scope 3 emissions, in that case, I would need support from them. In that case, if you kind of run a joint capability exercise or even a joint pilot exercise with those vendors, they would be much more open to kind of run those programs even in a pilot basis, even to kind of take additional efforts, go beyond the line to kind of meet these requirements, because they see your skin on the game in the game, and also know that, yeah, like there is something that we are trying to jointly address, jointly come up with, so that it becomes a case study or something that we can show to the larger world. And final thing would be conducting a internal lesson or a program refresh for everyone in the committee that we talked about. I've seen in multiple companies that we do run the program, and the final outcome is that it has to be put in, let's say, an annual report or sustainability report, and the main program was never briefed to the committee or never briefed to the MD or even the team that what has actually happened. For them, if they ask what has happened, they will tell that, yeah, like it is already on the report which is being published. You can definitely look into it. So then again, like it becomes very much disconnected in this entire program, because you have to run this program again with the same stakeholders. They need to know what has happened, what were the gaps, what are the new action plan for them, what will be the added expectation here, or they are doing good, they need to kind of change the platform, change the consultant, they don't need a consultant, they can do it in-house. Whatever change it is, right? Like from a refresh viewpoint, what are the changes needed, what actually went well and what didn't go as per the plan, that needs to be communicated not only internally to the procurement team but also the larger stakeholder in mind.